Yes. My father is a complicated man. He had his own horrific upbringing, truly horrific. And in many ways, I think that shaped who he became as a man and who he still is today. I think it affects him. I think it always will. Um, when I was a youngster and I got a Bible for the first time, I didn't know my father. He was hardly ever around. He was working all the time until I was much older, probably 11 or 12. I have some memories of him as a youngster, but very, very few, because he was working so much. So my initial impression of God was drawn from the Bible, and I think it was wholesome. I think I had a wonderful, beautiful understanding of the biblical representation of God as a child. But as I began to grow older and more or less met my dad and discovered who he was and found out he was complicated and he could be violent, very angry most of the time, very judgmental, I think my impression of God began to change because I saw my father modeling that role for me, and I think that informed my idea of God the Father. So I think it would only be right to say it did change my impression, and I did become confused of who God was, and ultimately it formed my adult belief. I think that, along with other outside influences, formed my belief that God was a judgmental figure and was looking for my good deeds in order that I might achieve approval, or his approval, which couldn't be further from the biblical picture of God if I tried. So that was my impression of God as a young man, and it was born out of both my childhood and my upbringing. I came to know God as a young boy. For the first time, when I was a youngster, my mum bought my brothers and I Bibles, Good News Bibles. So ever since I was a little boy, I was reading the Word. I felt no restriction. I had a Bible and I would read whatever. If I opened the book at Revelation, that's what I read. If I opened it on the Psalms, that's what I read. I think I really fell in love with the Proverbs first. So I had a really good grounding in the Bible from an early age. And an introduction to God really began through me just reading the Word. We did grow up in a home where there were more or less Christian values, although they were strange. But it took a number of years for me to come to know Jesus the way I think he wanted me to know him, as a loving father. For me as a youngster, God was always a very judgmental figure, the big man in the sky that you didn't want to make angry. That kind of concept is how I held God as a youngster. So I knew God as a youngster, but I wouldn't have told you that I'd met the real God if you asked me now, until I was much older, probably in my early 20s. And that came about through a series of hard events and me kicking against the goads in a big way. Yeah. When I was about 17, our family farm was foreclosed. The bank foreclosed on the family farm, and we lost everything. So the house that I grew up in wasn't an ordinary farmhouse on a farm. It was quite a special house. It was our family inheritance, really. My great-great-great-grandfather had built it as a counterpiece to Groote Schuur in the Cape, which was Cecil John Rhodes's sort of great masterpiece. My great-great-grandfather was an industrialist and decided he would build his own version of Groote Schuur, but on the Highveld. And so he hired the same architect, Sir Herbert Baker, and built the house on the Highveld. And it was, at the time that we lived in it, was the largest privately owned house in Southern Africa. The house itself had 54 rooms, and the farm itself was massive before it was apportioned. And so yeah, it wasn't an ordinary house, an ordinary farm. The auction for the farm was very carefully controlled, and we walked away with very little money to start a new life. And I remember we all left that familiarity, the only thing that us boys pretty much had ever known, and we moved about 400 miles away to start again, with very little to nothing. And we found ourselves in the Lowveld, in the Bushveld in South Africa, a town called Nelspruit. And having no identifiable skills, we had to find work so that we could earn an income. And the only thing we could think to do was to go and waiter in restaurants. My mom had been a waitress in America, put herself through UCLA doing that, and she suggested it, and we went to the local restaurants, and we all got work, so that was great. But it was the first time I think we'd really been exposed to any kind of urban setting where there was nightclubs, there was cinemas, malls, girls, cars, not just tractors, and we kind of went mad. We gradually became more and more independent as we worked. We were earning our own salaries. We were, for the first time, working away from my father, which was great because my father was quite controlling. I think he had to be on the farm. And we gradually became involved in the nightclub scene. All of us did, and we were enticed by all that the city had to offer. And I guess I gradually began to fall into a partying way of life. Earning my own money became very easy to spend my own money, even though the majority of it we were taking home to support the family. But I found myself clubbing. My brother and I turned out to be really good at going crazy on the dance floor, and we'd win dance competitions. So that was wonderful. It was like attention like I'd never had before. And gradually my life, I would say, unraveled, which is ironic because we'd almost discovered life in the city, and then it began to spiral down. I began to abuse alcohol very badly, to the point where I would say I became addicted to it. There was a series of events at home. Home life was gradually collapsing after the loss of the farm. My father was gradually sinking into depression. My mum was more or less his full-time carer. And so we were all at one level or another going off the rails, I think. So, yes, alcohol became my mainstay, or my go-to, to sort of forget, blank out, check out. And I experimented with all sorts of different drugs, anything in a pill form. I was happy to try anything you could burn and inhale. I did that. Anything you could inhale, I did that. By the grace of God, I was never brave enough, I think, to inject anything, which is a blessing when I think about it now. But alcohol really became my poison, and I descended so far down that road that I became dependent on it even to function. I would wake up in the mornings and I would be shaking and need some alcohol just to stop that happening. I became increasingly violent. I became emotionally distant or even numb. By that stage I had a girlfriend, and we were living together, and I would go out at night after she'd gone to bed and just do completely silly things I don't really remember. I would be spotted all over town with a hunting knife and just wearing a pair of jeans, and I would come home, and when we woke up in the morning I'd be covered in blood, or I'd have wounds all over myself. And as it became worse and worse, my dependency on alcohol grew. There were a number of events where God really began to wake me up, and I felt him asking the question, what are you doing with your life? And at that point I was really angry with God. I'd become so angry with the God, at least the God that I knew or thought I knew, because my life situation has more or less unraveled, or was unraveling, and I think I blamed God for that, which is ridiculous, but I did. And that anger manifested itself in me essentially not caring whether I lived or died. I became determined, I think, to waste my life. And as that became worse and worse, and I was determined to either kill myself through something I was doing or through drinking, God began to show me that He cared for me. And I heard Him speaking in various ways. The one time that I felt God clearly talk to me was when I had a car accident for the first time. The car that I was driving left the road. I lost control. I was in the rain, raining very heavily. I hit a dirt embankment. I wasn't wearing a seatbelt. My head went through the windshield and my abdomen hit the steering wheel and stopped me going any further. But I didn't realize it at the time, but I sustained serious internal injuries, and the pericardial sac and diaphragm had all been ripped away, and I began bleeding internally quite seriously, and I didn't realize it, so I went back to work that night. And by the end of the night I was just feeling violently ill. I went to bed, or at least I tried. I couldn't sleep. I woke up vomiting at some point in the night. I couldn't stand up. I was just doubled over. None of these muscles here were working. And I crawled about a mile to a pharmacy and asked them for the painkillers. In South Africa you used to be able to get really strong painkillers without a prescription, so I got a bunch of those, and they didn't really help. And by the end of that day, my brother said, we're taking to the hospital, because I felt as though I couldn't even breathe anymore. My diaphragm wasn't working. Ended up at the hospital. They did a scan. I couldn't tell you what scan. I just remember being in a big room and this giant arm going around. And the doctor showed me the scan, and he showed me a thick black band. There's my lungs, there's your heart, there's this black band underneath, and said, that's blood that's pooling in your abdomen. It said, for some reason it stopped. And he said to me, these types of injuries don't stop bleeding on their own. You should be either dead or close to dying at this point. But he gave me painkillers and sent me home. So I knew at that point that I really felt God was in control, and that He was speaking to me. So that was the first of a couple of major incidents that happened. I had another car accident a couple of months later. I was in the car with another woman, and we were going along a dirt track late at night, and I was speeding, and we plowed into a concrete reservoir side on, and totaled the car. But for some reason none of us had a scratch on us, neither of us was even bruised, and we walked away with no injuries whatsoever. That was the second time where I felt God saying to me, what are you doing? If you keep on going this way, then you're going to get what you wish. You're going to get an early death, you're going to get a meaningless death. But He was tugging me so tenderly and talking to me about the road that I was on, the choices I was making. One night I was spotted walking along a highway or a main road with no clothes on, knife in my hand, blood all over, and one of my father's acquaintances spotted me, but he apparently was too afraid to stop and pick me up, because he didn't know what my state of mind was or what had transpired. When my dad related that story to me, it was as though I was hearing him talking about someone else. I didn't really identify that as being me, but it made me think how bad things were getting. So that was another time when I felt God was speaking to me quite clearly about how desperate things had become. And then one night, by that stage I'd started carrying a firearm when I could get one. Used to put it on my ankle or in my crotch, wherever I could hide it to get into a nightclub. But one night I decided I wanted to go out dancing, and I left the firearm at home, which was by the grace of God when I think back now. But I ended up in a club and entered the dance competition and started dancing, and we were on the dance floor. At some point in the night, probably around 1 or 2 in the morning, I don't remember exactly what the time was, but a fight broke out in the club, and it was quite clear that it was serious. There were a couple of guys there from Joburg, and they were essentially ganging up on this one chap who'd hit on one of their girlfriends. And he was absolutely off his legs, drunk. He didn't even know what he was doing. Anyway, the fight escalated quite quickly and ended up outside. The club overlooked a forecourt of a garage, and they beat him quite badly, beat him to the ground, and he was trying to stagger to his feet for ages. And while that was happening, they went off and got their car, and he just managed to get to his feet when they came speeding around the corner, hit him with the car and sped off, and he flipped over the roof and landed on the ground. I was watching this from the balcony of the club, which was sort of up and away from the club, looking over. And when I saw that, I just jumped off the balcony. I went up to him trying to help him, and the minute he landed on his back, this pool of blood started to gather underneath him. And I remember thinking he needs help. Again, by the grace of God, I hadn't been drinking that night, so I was for once sober in a club. And I went up to him and I tried to make him lie down, and it quickly became apparent that he had a serious injury because the blood was just absolutely pouring out of him. And I could see he had a wound on his leg where I imagine the bonnet must have struck him, and it almost cut his leg off. There was the artery was, his femoral artery was sticking out. What was left of it was poking out, and it was just pouring blood. And he was in no state to even understand what was happening. He had gashes and cuts all over his head, but I don't think he even realized what was going on. But I lay him down. I took off my t-shirt. I tried to fashion a tourniquet for his leg. I tried to hold the artery, but it was impossible. There was just a horrific amount of blood, and it was sticky, and it was everywhere. And I was trying this for about probably 5 minutes. All the time he's fighting me, pushing me away, trying to get me to stop, telling me he's fine, he can get up, he's going back into the club. And at some point I looked up and looked around at the crowd, and everyone who had been in the club had now come outside, and they were watching this unfold. But no one was doing anything. No one was trying to help, no one was calling an ambulance, no one was getting a belt off to use as a tourniquet, nothing. No one was doing anything. And again, a few minutes later, I suppose, his friends appeared. It was a group of young men who obviously knew him, and they pulled him and loaded him into a pickup truck and drove him off to the hospital. But by that stage, he was already losing consciousness. He was as pale as a sheet. And to this day, I'm convinced that he bled to death before they ever got to the hospital, because the hospital was a ways away, and he'd lost a huge amount of blood. So they drove him off, and I looked around, and I was kneeling in this pool of blackcurrant jam, which was blood. And it was all over me, it was in my hair, it was on my back, I had handprints all over me where he was pushing me off. And everyone just slowly started to dissipate. The crowd slowly started to go back inside, and the music started up, and I was just left there kneeling on the ground. My jeans soaked in this guy's blood, and within about 2 minutes, someone came out from the garage with a hose and started hosing down the blood. And I have to say, I had what I would describe as a moment of clarity. I felt God. Amazingly enough, it felt tender in that moment. God was saying to me, is this really how you want to live your life? Is this really the path that you want to go down? And I just felt like God was saying he had so much more for me if I would just trust him and turn back to him. So that was the moment for me when I really surrendered, and I said, God, I'm done, more or less. I can't keep fighting you because I'm going to lose. I'm already losing. About 2 weeks later, my girlfriend got a call from the UK. Her parents had gone over to the UK, found work after struggling for a few years, and they wanted to reunite the family and said, we want you to come over. And my girlfriend said, I won't come unless you bring my vagrant boyfriend with. And I agreed. What was I going to do? There was no prospect for me where I was, and that was really the beginning of the turnaround for me. So, yeah.
So you said kneeling in the blood that was thick and sticky, no shirt on, blood all over you because you were trying to save that guy's life, and at the end of it, while you were kneeling there, your thoughts were back on God?
Yes.
It was a moment.
It was a moment. I had a moment where I've never heard the audible voice of God speaking to me, but it was in my heart. I felt God was saying to me, and God was the last thing on my mind. There was no reason why I should even be thinking of God, and I just felt Him impressing upon me, look at that life. That life is over. Is that really what you want? So yes, my mind suddenly turned to God very quickly, and the reality of how I was living, in a sense, dawned on me. That may sound insane when I tell how I was living, but maybe I was waiting for God to do that, to reveal Himself, to show me that He cared, and He showed up.
Right then. So that's an amazing story and journey you've been on. So where are you guys at now?
Thank you. It is. God is good. I'm happily married to the girlfriend in the picture that I spoke about earlier. We met when I was 19. She was 21. We've been married for about 11 years now, and we have 3 beautiful children, all under 10, and living and settled in the UK. My relationship with God is key to everything in my life. It is my life. I can't imagine it without Jesus at the center. And I'm growing more and more into knowing Him. My greatest comfort is reading the Bible. I've read it cover to cover probably at least 15 times. I can't get enough, which is a gift from God, and something I continually pursue, especially when I don't feel like it. So God is continuing to draw me closer to Himself, open my mind to who He is, open my heart to love like He loves. I'm in no way perfect, and I fall down all the time. In fact, I was just saying last night, I feel like Mephibosheth in the Bible, who had to be carried everywhere because he was lame in his legs. I feel like God carries me an awful lot, but that relationship is central to who I am, and that is who I am.